now. Republican Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, who, of course, is the vice chairman of the Intelligence Committee, also a senior member of the Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, thank you very much. I just wanted to read something that just came from President Zelensky and has been confirmed by the White House, that he and President Biden, have been on the phone. They've been talking this morning. The Zelensky tweet is, just had a conversation with POTUS, the American leadership, on anti-Russian sanctions, and defense assistance to Ukraine was discussed. We must stop the aggressor as soon as possible. Thank you for your support. So, are we doing enough? What more do we need to do? What do you want to see from the U.S.?
Well, look, I think that what's happened over the last, week is really unprecedented. I mean, the Russian economy is headed towards collapse. The ruble most certainly is, and that's something I don't think anybody, including Putin, anticipated. I think he thought he would get hit hard, but not this hard. There are a couple things we have to start thinking through. I think the first is, and you've pointed to it in that reporting before I came on the air, the unique aspects of this refugee crisis. That is largely women and the elderly and young children, whose fathers and husbands are still in Ukraine and may make it back and may not. Who knows when they'll be reunited? And so that's a unique aspect of it. These are people that a week ago were living normal lives, going to school, running their businesses, going to work, and a week later find themselves in a tent city. And so that's something we certainly need to keep an eye on and provide all the assistance we can, along with everybody around the world, to help them in the short term. The second is, look, Putin can't win. I mean, he's headed to one of two directions here. He's either headed towards a very costly military victory, or he's headed towards a quagmire in which his military can't achieve victory. If even the costly military victory, he's going to have to stay there forever and face an insurgency. He's not just fighting another military. He's fighting 40-something million people that don't want his forces there. And no matter what he does, he'll never be able to install some puppet traitor government that he can just get up and leave them behind, because the Ukrainians will overthrow him and kill those people. So I think we have to start thinking through the permeations of this. No matter what, there always has to be a real, legitimate Ukrainian state that we have a relationship with. And I don't know why we can't begin to openly say we will support them as long as they are willing to fight, even if it's an insurgency. And what more can we do if it's an insurgency without putting boots on the ground, which would, as the president has said, and as NATO has said, Stoltenberg has said, this would be an Article 5 issue, and the Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and it raises all kinds of problems. I don't know whether you think that's the right policy, but that is the policy. Yeah, no, I don't think anyone's talking. I mean, look, an armed engagement between the United States and any NATO or any NATO country and Russia is World War III. So I don't think anyone is talking about it. And frankly, the Ukrainians are not asking for American troops. What they are asking for is that we continue to supply and to equip them. And I'm not saying that by any means this fight is over. I think the will to fight, which is one of the hardest things to measure in any conflict, is extraordinary on the Ukrainian side. There are real and growing questions about the morale and the technical capability, the logistical capability of the Russian forces. That said, if in fact Putin is able to achieve, for example, a military victory, that doesn't mean he's won, because he will face Ukrainians that will fight him, and we need to continue to provide them with whatever we can provide them with to carry that out. There will be a legitimate Ukrainian government, no matter what happens militarily on the ground. But I still think there's a lot of open questions about how long and how costly this is going to be for Vladimir Putin from a military standpoint within Ukraine. I think the costly war situation is probably his best case scenario, and that's not a very good one.
President Putin has been really isolated. It's obvious he has not traveled other than to Beijing the one time that we know of under COVID. We've seen the long tables, how he's only talking to a couple of people, very few people, if that, not taking advice. How concerned are you about his mental health, his state of mind as he controls this vast military? One of your tweets was, I wish I could say more. For now, I can say it's pretty obvious to many that something is off with Putin. What is off with Putin?
Yeah, so I'll tell you what's off with him. I think what's off with him, frankly, is he's almost 70 years old in a country where the average man makes it to 72. He sees his legacy as being the man who brought Russia out of the 90s humiliation into great global power status, restored greater Russia. Ukraine is a big part of it. I thought he viewed this as his last opportunity to do it. I think this is a person who calculates very differently than he did 5 or 10 years ago. You've seen in his own statements, this is a man who's always sort of prided himself on emotional control, and he showed very strong flashes of anger that is apparent for everyone to see. And the isolation piece is important. It's not just a physical isolation. Like most authoritarians, this is not a man whose underlings bring him the truth. or bring him bad news. So it's my sense that he thought that he would be greeted in parts of Ukraine as a liberator, and that the Ukrainian resistance would quickly collapse, and that Zelensky would flee to outside the country, and that by now he would certainly control Kyiv. And none of that has played out. And so I just don't think we should fall into the trap of assuming that Putin today would make the same calculus or the same decisions that he would have made 5, 10, or 15 years ago. I think that's a lot of the people that were thinking that way were the ones saying there's no way he's going to invade because it didn't make any sense. It may not make any sense if he thought like an American, but he doesn't. He thinks like someone who wants to be a great historic figure like Catherine the Great in Russian lore. And that's how he's viewing things. And that poses some real potential dangers of escalation.
Are you concerned when he twice raised the nuclear threat?
Well, a couple things. First of all, that's the military doctrine of Russia. It's a written doctrine that basically says in any conflict with NATO, if they begin to lose, as they would in a conventional fight, they would use battlefield nuclear weapons to escalate and force everyone to the negotiating table. But I am concerned about the fact that this is someone who clearly has, his country's deeply isolated now. Their economy's in free fall. They're suffering humiliations on the battlefield. Instead of making Russia look like a great power, they look incompetent in many ways. And so what are his tools available to equalize the situation and giving him some bargaining leverage? They're not very good ones. He doesn't have economic tools. He can either escalate military into something horrifying. He can threaten or carry out cyber attacks against the West, including the United States. And he can threaten to use battlefield nuclear weapons. I think that's probably the least likely option of the three, the last one, the nuclear weapons. But that's their doctrine. And I think he was reminding us of that.
Do you actually think he would use battlefield nuclear weapons?
Well, I think no matter what his state of mind is, I think he understands that if he were to use tactical nuclear weapons in a battlefield, that most certainly would trigger potentially the Third World War, and he would not go down as a historic figure because there wouldn't be anyone left to talk about it, on his side or ours. So I think he prefers not to escalate to that point. But you worry that when someone begins to run out of escalation options and they're left with things like some attack in space, some attack in cyber, that these things begin to escalate. And that's the point. Escalation in any kind. Right now, the Bosphorus is being closed off by the Turks. What if the Russian Navy decides to ignore that order and try to proceed through, and they're confronted by NATO ships? Now you have a NATO conflict. There's some real danger embedded in this. That doesn't mean we shouldn't stand up to them. That just means we need to be aware that there are some real dangers of escalation here that maybe are being a little underappreciated by some.
Senator Rubio, thank you so much. It's really important to have your views.
Thank you.
We really appreciate